When did a holy water fight on a cruise ship become your shared custody battle? I literally just got off the phone with the cruise line legal team, and I am sitting here in my home office at 2:37 a.m. on a Thursday in a towel because I forgot to change out of my sweat-drenched clothes after pacing for 4 hours. My Apple Watch says I did 14,000 steps indoors. This is not even the half of it. I found out maybe 6 hours ago that the reason the entire Panama Canal cruise descended into chaos was because of a holy water fight gone sideways. And now Xavier Lopez, 56M, the guy who literally wrote the low-contact, high-efficiency enforcement policy for the entire neighborhood association, I'm the one who is supposed to figure out how to navigate these harassment charges using the framework of a shared custody schedule. I'm not kidding. Custody schedule. For two grown men who are fighting over the proper prayer cadence on a luxury ship, I honestly don't even know where to start with this mess, but I guess I need to start with Elijah Carter, 57M. If you live in this area, you know Elijah. He is the PTA Karen, but for the entire world. He doesn't even have kids in school anymore, but he is at every single school board meeting, demanding specific organic milk brands for the high school cafeteria and auditing the maintenance schedules of the community pool filtration system. He is the kind of guy who sends triple-spaced emails with 14 attachments, all highlighted in 3 different colors. I have known him since fall 2019 when we both fought over the last organic free-range chicken at Costco, and ever since then it's been a forced proximity nightmare. He's always trying to involve me in his causes, asking for my expertise, which is really just my ability to say no and enforce strict boundaries, hence the low-contact enforcer label everyone slapped on me. My phone currently shows 27 missed calls from him alone in the last hour, and I've been actively ignoring him. And GL, I threw my iPhone 14 into the linen hamper just so I couldn't hear the vibrating. The battery is only at 32% though, so I have maybe an hour before the calls start routing to my iPad. So the big mistake, the cruise. We booked this 7-day luxury cruise through the Panama Canal. It was supposed to be my escape. I had 47 PTO hours left to burn before they reset, and my workload on the 5th floor of the municipal building was getting ridiculous. I needed to relax, read the 4 books I bought at Target last week, and maybe drink a frozen margarita without having to worry about someone complaining that the umbrella was improperly sanitized. Spoiler alert, I didn't get to read any books. Elijah found out I was going, obviously, because he gets copied on every single newsletter, itinerary, and emergency contact form for every community member. I still don't know how he does this. Maybe he hacked the server. I wouldn't put it past him. He immediately decided it was a sign from God that he should also take this cruise. He booked the cabin right next to mine, 3B, which meant I woke up every morning at 6:00 a.m. to the sound of him doing aggressive, heavy-breathing yoga while listening to a TED Talk about optimal digestive health. But wait, it gets worse because Elijah didn't come alone. He brought Alexander Ramirez, 51M. Alexander is Elijah's friend, but truly Alexander is just Elijah's echo. He copies everything. Elijah starts using a new catchphrase. Alexander uses it 20 minutes later. Elijah bought a Peloton. Alexander bought a cheaper, slightly knockoff stationary bike and tried to show it off constantly. Elijah decided to start wearing specific brand of linen trousers. Alexander bought 5 pairs of identical, slightly wrinklier linen trousers. It's annoying but usually benign. This cruise, however, Alexander decided to copy Elijah's deeply entrenched, extremely specific religious practices. See, Elijah is part of this very niche, very traditional offshoot of a major faith, and he takes it seriously. Like every prayer must be timed perfectly, and he uses specific implements that look vaguely medieval. Alexander, who 3 weeks before the cruise told me he was considering becoming an atheist because he liked the look of certain minimalist furniture at IKEA, suddenly converted and was now 3 times as zealous, trying to outpray Elijah every morning. It was giving major competition energy, you know. The first 3 days were pure mundane torture. Trying to get coffee at the Starbucks on Deck 7 meant running into them arguing about whether consuming the ship's buffet bacon would constitute an acceptable minor sin or a mortal transgression. I saw Alexander check his credit card statement on his Samsung Galaxy, looking stressed because he probably spent the $43.67 grocery budget he usually uses at Trader Joe's on some unnecessary religious artifact instead. I was honestly just trying to lay low. I put my noise-canceling AirPods in, ordered a massive Talenti gelato, and attempted to watch Netflix on my iPad, but then Susan Moore, 41F, showed up. Susan is the woman's planer, you know the type. She corners you, usually after a bad experience, and then explains to you at length why your entire perception of reality is incorrect, but she does it in a tone that implies she is the savior of your fragile masculine soul. She was on the cruise for some kind of holistic retreat that involved mandatory sea salt scrubs and journaling. She saw me trying to avoid the Elijah Alexander drama on day 4, and she came over unsolicited and said, "Xavier, darling, you need to understand the feminine energy of what is happening here. Their spiritual struggle is a microcosm of patriarchal reliance on rigid structure. You are resisting their flow." I just wanted to scream, but I smiled that tight smile, the one that says, I am a low-contact enforcer and my boundaries are titanium reinforced. I mumbled something about needing to check my work email, which was a total lie because I had zero intention of checking my 247 unread messages in my work inbox. I am not getting paid for overtime on this vacation, NGL. Then Randy Alexander, 31M, entered the picture. Randy is a piece of work. He was cruising with his fiancée, and they were the most aggressively child-free people I have ever met. Randy was the self-appointed child-free wedding enforcer for his own upcoming nuptials. Every conversation he started was about his registry, no kids allowed, $200 minimum gift required, and how he was using his 6 sick days from work to recover from the stress of planning a perfectly curated, adult-only experience. He was constantly wearing an Apple Watch that tracked his stress spikes whenever he saw a stroller. He literally looked like he was vibrating with repressed rage 90% of the time. Randy naturally hated Elijah and Alexander. Why? Because the very rigid religious practices of the two older men often involved loud, dramatic lamentations at 5:30 p.m., right when Randy was trying to enjoy his pre-dinner bespoke cocktail. Randy complained endlessly. He started a public online petition on the cruise ship's internal social network demanding that all unauthorized public prayer rituals cease. This guy was unhinged. He would stand there waiting for Elijah to start his evening rite, holding his phone up, recording every dramatic groan and kneel, literally trying to catch him violating some obscure ship regulation. The tension was getting thick, like that disgusting gravy they served one night at the buffet. It all exploded Tuesday at 11:47 a.m. We were sailing somewhere near the equator. Elijah and Alexander had been escalating their religious one-upmanship. It started with comparing Bible verse memorization, moved to wearing increasingly larger and more cumbersome holy garments in the tropical heat. Alexander was visibly sweating through his $400 Amazon tunic, and then it turned physical. Apparently, Elijah received a $347 bill from a specialty religious supplier, and Alexander received an identical $347 bill because he copied him. This led to a huge public shouting match about who had the purer spiritual debt. Randy was, of course, lurking. He was trying to get footage of them blocking the main promenade because he wanted to prove they were disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of paying customers. He kept muttering about his $1,247 portion of the cruise rent and how this was an unacceptable breach of contract. And then the holy water incident. Elijah, in a fit of zeal and competitive spirit, had brought a massive canteen of sanctified water. He claimed he needed it for a very specific cleansing ritual on the observation deck. Alexander, copying him, had his own smaller bottle, but he had run out and was desperate for more. I was actually nearby, trying to use the ship's tragically slow Wi-Fi to sell my portion of the rent to my roommate and scrolling through TikTok, completely ignoring Susan Moore, who was trying to explain to me how my low-contact enforcement style was actually a trauma response. I heard Alexander shout, I need the blessed moisture, Elijah. My spirit is dry." Elijah, always the drama queen, said, "This water is for prayer, Alexander, not for your cheap imitation. You are a spiritual parasite." And then Elijah did it. He took the massive canteen and dumped a good portion of the consecrated liquid right over Alexander's head. Alexander looked like a drowned rat, sputtering, his expensive, wrinkly linen clothes soaked. Alexander, instead of fighting back physically, went completely unhinged. He ran straight into the gift shop, grabbed maybe 7 bottles of those overpriced souvenir bottled waters, and started tearing off the lids. He ran back out soaking wet, eyes wide, and screamed, "If I can't have the blessed water, no one can have peace." Then he started aggressively spraying the plain Fiji water everywhere. And who did he hit? Randy Alexander 31M, the child-free wedding enforcer who was wearing his brand new, extremely expensive white linen resort shirt. Randy lost it. This was not the kind of perfectly curated adult experience he paid for. Randy dropped his phone, cracked the screen, I heard the crunch, and yelled, "That is assault. You just ruined my $200 shirt. This is harassment." Alexander, thinking he was still in a spiritual battle, started spraying Randy with more bottled water, screaming something about purification. Elijah, seeing the physical confrontation, decided to join in, using his empty canteen as a makeshift club and yelling about spiritual integrity. It escalated immediately into a full-blown, chaotic water-based melee involving 2 very religious men, one extremely enraged man in a ruined white shirt, and a whole lot of expensive bottled water. Security showed up, obviously, but not before Randy was thoroughly soaked and screaming that Alexander was attempting a religious conversion by force. And Elijah was just laughing maniacally while Susan Moore stood on the side, filming it all on her phone and explaining loudly to a horrified family of 4 that this is the masculine archetype trying to process its repressed rage, you see. Xavier, the low-contact enforcer, ducked behind a pillar and pretended to be intensely interested in the ship's emergency fire safety instructions. The fallout was immediate. Randy, being Randy, didn't just want an apology or a voucher for the dry cleaner. Randy went nuclear. He filed official criminal harassment charges against both Elijah and Alexander, claiming religious discrimination and emotional distress that would surely ruin his upcoming child-free wedding. He cited the exact time, 11:47 a.m., and the cost of the ruined shirt, exactly $200, which he conveniently had the receipt for on his phone, the one with the cracked screen. Elijah and Alexander were confined to their rooms, cabin 3A and 3B, which was pure torture for them and heaven for the rest of us. And the legal call came in this evening, catching me right as I was about to order $43.67 worth of Ben & Jerry's on Amazon Fresh. The lawyer on the phone, a woman who sounded exhausted, said, "Mr. Lopez, we understand you are the neighborhood mediator for these parties." I tried to enforce my boundaries immediately. No, ma'am, I am the low-contact enforcer. I enforce policy. I do not mediate emotional disputes. I specifically try to maintain distance. She sighed deeply. Well, you are the only sane contact we have. Here's the problem. Randy Alexander is demanding full permanent separation from both parties, claiming irreparable harm to his spiritual and wedding planning journey. Elijah and Alexander, being neighbors, share mutual community resources, the pool schedule, the community center, the trash collection policy, which means total separation is impossible. I felt my stomach drop, like when you miss a step going down the stairs. Ma'am, with respect, I do not understand how this concerns me. This is a harassment charge. It is a legal matter. It is, but it's rooted in religious incompatibility and public nuisance, the lawyer said. The judge is trying to find a novel solution to this chronic neighborhood problem before it escalates again. Since full separation is unfeasible, and since both Elijah and Alexander claim their religious practice demands access to public amenities at specific times, the judge is suggesting we implement a highly structured schedule to ensure all parties receive adequate space and time. A schedule? I asked, already dreading the formatting requirements. Yes, she said, and this is the part that made me throw my towel across the room and start pacing. Randy's lawyer is demanding, and the judge seems inclined to agree, that we implement a shared, legally binding custody schedule for the neighborhood common areas, including the gym and the mailroom. We need to draft a precise schedule down to the minute, outlining exactly when Elijah can practice his specific right, when Alexander can attend the community center without overlapping, and when Randy is guaranteed a religious trauma-free zone. They are calling it the Ritual Time Sharing Agreement, modeled specifically on a high-conflict child custody schedule. I stared at the wall. My job is enforcing boundary lines, not drawing up visitation rights for community facilities based on who is angrier about holy water. And Mr. Lopez, the lawyer continued, her voice sounding dead tired, since you are the established enforcement expert, we need you to draft the first working draft of the schedule, including penalty clauses for noncompliance. Randy's lawyer is demanding that Elijah and Alexander pay a $2,000 fine every time they violate the mandatory distance requirements. Your deadline is tomorrow at 5:00 p.m. I wanted to say no. I wanted to scream. I was on PTO. I wanted to tell her that Susan Moore had convinced Alexander that the entire ordeal was an opportunity for spiritual reparenting, and that he was now demanding that Elijah formally apologize by washing his feet. But before I could even formulate a coherent sentence about my vacation days, the lawyer hit me with the real bomb. Also, she said casually, Alexander just informed us that he is now demanding that the neighborhood association pay him back the $347 he spent on the religious artifact that caused the argument, citing the ship's duty of care. He also says he has received several threats, including one from Randy about keying his 2018 Honda Civic, and he wants a temporary restraining order enforced in the schedule. Oh, and Elijah claims that because Alexander is copying his specific faith, Alexander is actually committing spiritual identity theft, and he is also filing a counter-harassment claim. I felt the tight band across my chest. This wasn't just a schedule. This was a war plan for two men who could not stop fighting about religion and one man who literally couldn't handle being splashed. My internal processing system broke. Custody schedule for two 50-something-year-old men fighting over who gets access to the community yoga mats. I just said, I need details on the required distance parameters. And do I need to factor in the specific ritual times for the full moon? The lawyer hesitated. Yes, Mr. Lopez. We are going to need the lunar cycle incorporated into the draft. Get ready to draft a rotating 4-week visitation schedule for the community pool. And please just send me a text if you need to talk. My Android battery is dying at 3%. So that's where I am, 2:45 a.m., towel only, looking at the full calendar for the next 3 months and trying to figure out how to structure community access around celestial events and two men who clearly need therapy, not a legal document. I was supposed to be relaxing. Instead, I am drafting the Ritual Time Sharing Agreement. I'm dying to know what happens when I try to present this document to Randy, who will absolutely demand a specific penalty clause if Elijah uses the wrong kind of salt in his next purification rite. I have a feeling Randy's character development from child-free wedding enforcer to full-time litigation enthusiast is about to be very, very significant, and I'm stuck right in the middle, trying to keep my low-contact policy intact while drawing up a schedule for shared holy ground. I need advice, Reddit. Do I quit my job? Do I move to a remote cabin? Or do I just embrace the chaos and start charging them $85 an hour for my enforcement time? I honestly might need to just key Alexander's Civic myself just to prove a point about enforcement. What the actual hell do I do with the lunar cycle requirement? I am serious. I need advice, Reddit. Do I quit my job? Do I move to a remote cabin? Or do I just embrace the chaos and start charging them $85 an hour for my enforcement time? I honestly might need to just key Alexander's Civic myself just to prove a point about enforcement. What the actual hell do I do with the lunar cycle requirement? I am serious. So 2 days later, I am running on 3 hours of total sleep, fueled exclusively by cheap instant coffee and the pure concentrated fury that comes from drawing up a mandated schedule for shared community treadmills based on the waxing and waning of the moon. I charged them $150 an hour, by the way. I figured if I was going to lose my mind, I might as well get paid for the psychiatric damage. The lawyer, who I now just call Brenda, texted me at 5:00 a.m. demanding a draft of the distance parameters. I spent 4 hours drafting a document that essentially turned the community clubhouse into a demilitarized zone. I decided to enforce a mandatory 50-foot radius between Elijah Party A and Alexander Party B, when they were utilizing any shared community facility. Randy Party C was granted a 100-foot buffer from both, which was mathematically impossible since the community pool deck is only 60 feet wide, but Randy's lawyer insisted on the principle of the thing. I wrote in a clause saying, if physical parameters prevent adherence to distance requirements, the facility must be vacated immediately by the lowest priority party. The priority party status was where I really went off the rails. Since the whole thing stemmed from religious ritual, I had to assign specific blocks of time based on their declared prayer schedules. Elijah's faith demands specific morning rites, and Alexander's copycat faith demands competing, slightly earlier morning rites. Randy, meanwhile, demands access to the community yoga studio at 7:00 a.m. sharp, because that's when the sun hits the window for his optimal serenity and stress management, which is rich coming from a guy who sues people over a damp shirt. I had to buy a $19.99 subscription to an online lunar calendar just to figure out the proper allocation of the community pool hours. I swear the final schedule looked less like a legal document and more like a complicated bus timetable designed by a drunken astronomer. The draft of the RTSA was 47 pages long, 47 pages. It included Appendix A, approved prayer volumes decibels could not exceed 45 during specified quiet zones. Appendix B, shared custody of the community mailroom. Elijah gets even days, Alexander gets odd days, Randy gets the first 15 minutes of every Tuesday for pre-wedding correspondence. And Appendix C, the lunar cycle pool schedule, full moon access was split into 15-minute increments for purification rites, which I arbitrarily assigned based on who was louder during the cruise incident. I emailed the draft at 4:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the deadline, and immediately poured myself a glass of lukewarm tap water because I was shaking too much to open the nice Pellegrino I keep for emergencies. Then the feedback came in. Brenda texted me 2 words, call me. I called her back, she didn't even say hello, she just launched in. Xavier Alexander has filed a formal objection to Appendix B. He says he requires access to the mailroom on even days because his preferred religious supplier only ships on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which are historically even-numbered dates this quarter. Brenda, this is insane, I said, rubbing my temples. He can pick up his mail on the odd days, the mail doesn't disappear. He claims the spiritual energy of the package is diminished if it sits in the box for more than 18 hours, she replied, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. And Elijah is threatening a countersuit because the distance parameters mean he can't access the gym's specialized weight machine, which is located 52 feet from the yoga studio, which is Randy's mandated serenity zone. He can use the elliptical machine, I argued. He says the elliptical machine violates his core belief in optimal muscular definition, which is required for his daily meditation posture. This is when I realized that Randy wasn't the only one undergoing significant character development. Elijah Carter, the man who used to just complain about milk brands, had weaponized his faith into a finely tuned instrument of bureaucratic obstruction. Fast forward to Friday morning. I was supposed to be relaxing this entire week. Instead, I had a 9:00 a.m. video conference with Brenda, Randy's lawyer, a 28-year-old named Chad who kept referencing legal precedents from TikTok, and Alexander's new representative, who Susan Moore 41F had apparently recommended. Yes, Susan Moore, the womansplainer, had inserted herself directly into the legal process. Alexander's new representative was not actually a lawyer. It was Susan herself. She informed us via a shaky laptop camera where she was wearing a massive scarf despite the July heat that she was representing Alexander Pro C based on principles of restorative justice and the deconstruction of spiritual oppression. Chad, Randy's lawyer, looked like his brain had just short-circuited. Brenda just closed her eyes and took a deep, audible breath. I just stared at my screen, wishing I had a mute button for life. Susan started the meeting by announcing, "We must first address the trauma. Alexander is suffering from residual dampness and a deep sense of betrayal. His spiritual identity theft claim against Elijah is a cry for recognition of his authentic journey, which must be supported by the community." Chad immediately jumped in, pointing a manicured finger at his screen. Objection. Randy Alexander's emotional distress is compounded by this ridiculous LARPing. He filed charges over assault and $200 of ruined linen. We demand an immediate $2,000 fine and the establishment of a no-linen zone within 500 feet of Randy's property. I mentally logged the new demand, no-linen zone. I was truly drafting housing policy for lunatics. Elijah, who was dialing in from his living room, I could see his collection of extremely organized filing cabinets behind him, used the opportunity to launch a 5-minute monologue about how Alexander's conversion was a cheap marketing stunt designed to dilute the theological purity of the movement. I jumped in, trying to maintain order. Okay, we are going to table the spiritual identity theft claim for now. Susan, we need Alexander to comply with the 50-foot mandatory distance. Is that feasible? Susan, bless her heart, explained that Alexander couldn't comply because his current prayer rug required him to face Mecca, and Mecca was in a direction that frequently put him within 47 feet of the community gazebo, which was Elijah's mandated reflection area on Wednesdays. So he needs a different prayer rug location, I stated flatly. No, Xavier, Susan countered with that patronizing tone that suggests you've just proven yourself incapable of understanding basic physics or possibly breathing. He needs the community to respect the sacred nature of his directional alignment. The community gazebo must move. I had to mute myself and lean back in my chair. The community gazebo must move. This was the level of absurdity I was dealing with. I spent the rest of that day attempting to redline the RTSA to include clauses for directional alignment and gazebo relocation feasibility studies. I honestly felt my IQ dropping by the minute. A week went by where I successfully avoided everyone in the neighborhood. I switched my routine, only going to Costco at 7:00 a.m. when I knew Elijah was required to be meditating, and ordering all my groceries via Instacart. My job was enforcing this nightmare, but I was also actively enforcing my own low-contact rules in my personal life. TBH, I was proud of that. Then update, this morning he showed up at my door. It was Alexander Ramirez. He was wearing a slightly less wrinkly linen shirt, which I guess was progress, and he looked genuinely distressed. I opened the door maybe 3 inches, activating the low-contact enforcer shield. Alexander, if this is about the RTSA, you need to go through Susan. He ignored me, trying to push the door open gently. Xavier, please, this is important. It's about Randy. My boundary slipped slightly. Randy was the only reason I was doing this. What about Randy? He's leveraging the schedule to ruin my life, Alexander whispered dramatically. You see, the schedule you drafted granted Randy access to the community laundry room every Monday morning from 8:00 a.m. to 10:00 a.m. for his pre-wedding garment sanitization ritual. I checked the document in my head. Yeah, I had granted Randy that 2-hour block to get him to stop emailing us. He is using that time to sit in the laundry room, reading his wedding invitations and loudly reviewing his RSVP list, Alexander continued, his voice cracking. He's not even washing clothes. He is just sitting there, sipping organic iced tea and announcing which of his friends sent a gift under the $200 minimum and whether they are now off the list. I blinked. And this is a problem. How? He's doing it specifically while I am required by the RTSA to be using the adjacent fitness center, Alexander cried. I can hear him through the wall. Yesterday he loudly announced, Aunt Carol sent a $50 gift card and is bringing 3 children. Violation. She is off the list and the gift will be donated to charity. Xavier, he is using the mandatory schedule to inflict emotional trauma. This was unexpected. Randy Alexander, 31M, had truly evolved from child-free wedding enforcer to full-time emotional terrorist, leveraging legal language to inflict maximum passive-aggressive damage. I almost respected it. Alexander, the RTSA guarantees you a religious trauma-free zone while accessing the facilities, but it does not specify non-gossiping noise level for Randy's mandated time, I said, trying to sound lawyerly, even though I was just standing there in pajama pants. He's not gossiping, he's planning his wedding, and he is doing it so loudly it's like psychological warfare. He knows I can't concentrate on my rotational core exercises when I hear him judging Aunt Carol's $50. I sighed. Okay, go file a complaint with Susan about the volume level. I can amend Appendix A to include wedding planning decibel limits. Alexander just looked defeated. Susan told me I need to practice radical self-acceptance and realize that Randy's wedding planning is simply the natural flow of chaos in the masculine sphere. I wanted to find Susan Moore and duct tape her woman-splaining mouth shut. This was not helpful. This was just maximizing the chaos. I closed the door gently. I realized that my low-contact enforcement was failing because I was stuck mediating conflict by proxy. The more structure I provided, the more creatively they found ways to exploit the rules to harass each other. The whole system was self-perpetuating lunacy. By Tuesday, I was ready to quit everything. I had to incorporate a new, highly complex set of rules after Elijah claimed Alexander was using a specifically triggering brand of incense during his permitted time at the gazebo. Apparently, the scent reminded Elijah of a rival religious group from his childhood. I wrote a 4-page amendment listing approved and disapproved incense brands. Brenda called me late that night, sounding dangerously close to weeping. Xavier, we have a new problem. Alexander needs the restraining order now. Against Randy? I asked, instantly alert. I knew Randy was unhinged, but I didn't think he'd resort to physical threats outside of the cruise ship. No, Brenda sniffled. Against Elijah. Alexander showed up at the community pool during his mandated 15 minutes of full moon purification time, and Elijah was already there. I looked at the RTSA on my desk. That's impossible. Elijah's time was clearly defined as 2:00 a.m. to 2:15 a.m. Alexander was 2:15 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. There is a 5-minute mandatory transition period. Yes, but Elijah claimed he couldn't leave because he was mid-lamentation and physically couldn't move until the final phase of the rite, Brenda explained. Alexander arrived, saw Elijah blocking his access to the sacred corner of the pool and panicked. Alexander grabbed Elijah's religious staff. Wait, Elijah brought his medieval religious staff to the community pool. Yes, and Alexander grabbed it and threw it into the deep end. It immediately sank. Elijah claims this staff was a priceless artifact required for his morning prayers and is demanding Alexander pay for its replacement, citing malicious destruction of spiritual property. I sat down hard. Brenda, I'm done. I am physically incapable of mediating a fight over a sunken religious staff. This is not my job. I am an enforcer, not an aquatic archaeologist. You can't quit, Brenda hissed. The judge is actively looking at this case as a template for other high-conflict neighbor disputes. We need this schedule to work. The judge specifically mentioned your proven track record of low-contact efficiency in the preliminary filing. I felt a surge of pure, defiant rage. My track record is based on enforcing basic rules like don't park in fire lanes and turn off your outdoor lights at 10:00 p.m. It is not based on mediating spiritual weapon destruction. I am officially resigning from the role of RTSA coordinator. I hung up the phone. I literally threw my work laptop onto my bed and refused to look at it. I was done. But you know what? The low-contact enforcer cannot truly quit. My internal policy manual demands resolution even if I have to bend the rules of reality to achieve it. I needed to leverage the characters themselves. I needed to weaponize Randy's obsession with perfection and Alexander's copycat behavior. I took the next 24 hours to focus on Randy Alexander. I knew his wedding was in 3 weeks. His obsession with the $2,000 fine, which was the only part of the RTSA Chad liked, was his weak spot. I called Chad directly, bypassing Brenda entirely. "Chad," I said, putting on my most professional low-contact voice, which sounds like a very expensive lawyer who is bored with your peasant problems. "I need to discuss the non-compliance penalties." "Yes, the $2,000 fine. Randy thinks that's the only deterrent that works." "I agree," I said smoothly. "But we need to ensure that the fine is immediately enforceable or we risk procedural delays that could interfere with Randy's planned nuptials." Chad perked up. "Interfere? How? Think about it," I pressed. "If Elijah or Alexander violate the terms 3 days before the wedding, the resulting court date and mandatory mediation could very easily require Randy's attendance. We don't want Randy wasting his 6 sick days recovering from wedding stress on court appearances, do we?" Chad gasped. I could hear him scribbling furiously. "No, absolutely not. Randy needs peak serenity." "Exactly. So I am proposing a mandatory, legally binding 3-month cooling-off period effective immediately, which includes an absolute zero-tolerance policy for proximity violations. The fine remains $2,000, but I am also adding a mandatory community service requirement. 50 hours of work on the community gazebo landscaping project, which incidentally is right outside Alexander's window. But here's the kicker, Chad. If Randy files any further non-emergency complaints related to the RTSA in the next 90 days, he automatically waives his right to the $2,000 fine and must also serve 50 hours of community service." Chad sputtered. "Wait, if Randy complains, he gets community service. Why?" "Because Chad, Randy's continued focus on litigation is clearly interfering with his optimal serenity. The judge will see it as Randy voluntarily escalating conflict, thereby violating the spirit of the ritual time sharing agreement. The point of the RTSA is to enforce low contact. Randy is currently enforcing maximum contact via litigation. This is an enforcement measure for Randy's own boundary setting. It forces him to embrace the low contact model." I could practically hear the gears turning in Chad's head. Randy wanted perfection. Randy hated work. Randy definitely didn't want to spend 50 hours pulling weeds outside Alexander's window. Randy really hated the idea of losing his $2,000 vengeance money. "But Randy is the victim here," Chad weakly protested. "Randy is a party to the agreement and we are enforcing low contact," I reiterated firmly. "Tell Randy that if he wants his $2,000, he needs to shut up and enjoy his wedding planning for the next 3 months. No texts, no documentation, no loud laundry room pronouncements. If he files one more complaint, he gets a shovel and 50 hours of sweat equity." Chad reluctantly agreed to present the amendment to Randy. NGL, I felt a small, dark surge of power. I had finally managed to enforce my own policy low contact by turning Randy's vindictiveness against him. With Randy neutralized, the pressure was off the financial penalty, which was the primary source of escalation. Now, for Elijah and Alexander, I decided to address the spiritual identity theft claim head-on, not legally but logistically. I called Elijah. "Elijah," I said, skipping the small talk, "we need to discuss Alexander copying your specific faith practice. It's an insult. He is a plague on the purity of the rite." Elijah immediately launched into his prepared monologue. "I understand," I said calmly, "and I have found a solution that protects your unique spiritual identity and promotes mandatory distance." Elijah quieted down, intrigued. He loves the word mandatory. "The RTSA as currently drafted relies on both of you having distinct and separate ritual times. However, Alexander's ongoing attempts to replicate your practice make this difficult, as he constantly tries to use the same implements and locations, even when scheduled separately. This leads to violation and conflict, as proven by the sinking of the staff." "It was a spiritual weapon," Elijah shouted. "Precisely," I countered. "So here's the resolution. Alexander's claim of spiritual identity theft has merit. To protect the sanctity of your unique faith and to ensure maximum distance enforcement, we are requiring Alexander to adopt a different faith practice entirely." Silence on the line, then a confused what? "Effective immediately, Appendix D. Mandatory religious divergence is added to the RTSA. Since Alexander's original declared interest was in minimalism and Scandinavian furniture aesthetics before he copied your faith, we are mandating that Alexander pursue a spiritual path that is entirely incompatible with yours, and that requires minimal use of community space. You can't mandate religion." Elijah protested, even though he had been perfectly happy to weaponize his own faith against his neighbors. "Brenda assures me that since Alexander's current practice is declared to be inauthentic and causing financial and spiritual harm," your words, Elijah, "and since he is currently represented by a non-lawyer advocating for spiritual reparenting, a judge might very well mandate a temporary religious divergence designed to promote neighborhood peace. It is the only way to enforce true separation, which Randy demands." I played my final card. "If Alexander pursues a faith that requires him to be silent, alone, and inside his own home during community hours, the RTSA can be significantly simplified, and we can immediately enforce the $2,000 fine on Randy if he speaks out of turn. If Alexander continues to copy you, the RTSA becomes unenforceable and Randy gets off scot-free." I let that sink in. The idea of Randy escaping financial punishment terrified Elijah more than theological divergence. "What are you mandating Alexander pursue?" Elijah asked suspiciously. I suggested something quiet, maybe Zen Buddhism, maybe becoming a devout atheist who believes only in the sanctity of mid-century modern furniture, I said. Something that explicitly requires him to avoid chanting, holy water, and public lamentations, and requires him to declutter his expensive, wrinkly linen wardrobe. Elijah hesitated, then gave a slow, satisfied exhale. Mandatory religious divergence, I like the sound of that. It confirms my spiritual superiority. It confirms the distance requirement, I corrected him. You focus on your purity. We will ensure Alexander focuses on the purity of his minimalist aesthetic, far away from your pool time. I hung up, feeling faintly nauseous but effective. I had used my enforcement skills to engineer a solution where everyone got what they secretly wanted. Randy got his money if he stayed quiet, Elijah got spiritual validation, and I got my low-contact policy back. The last person was Alexander. I did not call him. I sent him a text containing only the newly drafted Appendix D, specifically the section mandating immediate exploration and adoption of non-confrontational indoor silence-based spiritual practice, effective within 48 hours. Alexander replied immediately. Susan says this is a truly transformative moment, a chance to shed the patriarchal reliance on competitive ritual and embrace true self-actualization. She says my new path is a spiritual deconstruction of faith itself, leading to a new level of emotional maturity. I'm going to buy some new specific books on mindfulness. Do you know which minimalist furniture brands have the best meditation cushions? I stared at the text. He was still copying, but now he was copying the concept of being unique as dictated by Susan Moore. It was perfect. His character development wasn't towards becoming his own man, but towards becoming a more internally focused copycat, which suited my purposes perfectly. Randy's character development was forced silence for cash. Elijah's character development was weaponized self-importance. And mine was becoming a spiritual manipulator. A week went by where I saw none of them. I finally got to read one of the books I bought at Target. I even managed to drink a frozen margarita without having an anxiety attack. The RTSA was signed by all parties, including Susan Moore, who signed in bright purple ink next to Alexander's name, citing spiritual cosigner, and Chad, who added 70 footnotes explaining Randy's rights to his $2,000. The document was filed with the Community Association. I got paid. It was a substantial check for my enforcement consultation. I immediately used the money to book a weekend trip to a silent retreat where no one could find me, and where the only scheduling required was when to eat the organic vegetables. 3 days after that, the shoe dropped. Randy Alexander, 31M, violated the RTSA. He didn't violate the distance parameter, and he didn't complain. He violated the community service clause I had secretly negotiated with Chad. I got a call from Brenda, who sounded like she was having a genuinely good time for the first time in months. Xavier, you are not going to believe this, she chuckled. Elijah found a loophole. Linen or lunar cycle? I asked, already dreading the answer. Neither. Randy's 6 sick days from work, he used them all to plan his wedding. He told Chad that since he was already out of PTO and he refused to spend his personal vacation time pulling weeds, he could not comply with the 50 hours of mandatory community service without violating his employment contract. So Elijah filed a motion demanding that if Randy could not complete the mandatory landscaping service, he must find a substitute to complete the 50 hours on his behalf. And Randy found a substitute? I asked skeptically. No, Brenda laughed outright. Elijah, in a fit of P.T. Akeron-style organization, hired someone to do the landscaping and then filed a lien against Randy's house for $5,000 to cover the cost of the professional service, citing the fine for noncompliance and the cost of the contractor. He also cited the exact time and date the contractor started work, 8:07 a.m. on a Thursday. My stomach tightened, but then I smiled. This was the beautiful, twisted symmetry of low-contact enforcement. Randy was now experiencing the full financial terror he had tried to inflict on Elijah and Alexander. He had been hoisted by his own desire for perfection and bureaucracy. I saw Randy the next day at the community mailbox, which was his mandated 15-minute slot. He looked defeated. His white resort shirt was still crisp, but his eyes were red. Xavier, he hissed, glancing around to make sure the 100-foot buffer was clear. Elijah just charged me $5,000 for landscaping I didn't even agree to. This is outrageous. He used my own legal framework against me. Randy, I said, collecting my mail calmly. The RTSA is designed to enforce the consequences of escalation. You demanded a $2,000 fine for noncompliance. Elijah merely applied that principle to your own noncompliance with the community service requirement. You failed to enforce your own schedule. But I was the victim of the holy water. And now you are the victim of superior organizational skills, I replied, walking away. I felt genuinely calm. My boundaries were titanium. I heard later that Randy had to postpone his child-free wedding for 6 months while he dealt with the $5,000 lien and the associated legal fees. He's now apparently spending his weekends learning municipal law, trying to find a zoning violation to report Elijah for. His character development is complete. He is now a full-time litigation enthusiast. I'm back because you won't believe what just happened this morning. I got a text. Not from Brenda, not from Elijah, and certainly not from Randy. It was from Susan Moore, 41F. She sent a single photo. It was Alexander Ramirez, sitting on a brand new, highly minimalist beige meditation cushion in his living room, wearing a simple gray t-shirt looking serene. In front of him was a $500 unwrinkled, sleek Danish wooden box containing what I assume was a very specific form of organic tea. The caption read, "Alexander is transcending the need for external validation. He has embraced the aesthetic purity of quiet contemplation. He is now focused on becoming the ultimate low-contact enforcer of his own spiritual space. He says you were his inspiration. I laughed out loud. Literally, I had successfully managed to enforce low contact on the two feuding zealots, turning one into a minimalist monk and the other into a financially penalized legal bureaucrat, all while maintaining my own distance. I still have the 47-page ritual time sharing agreement on my hard drive. I still occasionally stress eat Talenti gelato when I think about the lunar cycle pool schedule. And I know the piece is tenuous. Elijah will find a new way to weaponize the community association rules, and Randy will probably try to sue me for drafting the RTSA incorrectly. But I realized something important during all this chaos. My job isn't to mediate conflict, it's to enforce policy. And sometimes, the best policy is to create rules so absurdly specific and punitive that the participants enforce their own separation just to avoid the hassle. The only way to win a custody battle over a community pool is to make the shared time so unpleasant or expensive that nobody wants it anymore. I haven't talked to Elijah or Alexander in 4 months. Randy is still fighting the Leon. Susan Moore texts me inspirational quotes about boundary setting as radical self-care twice a week, which I immediately delete without opening. I am charging $200 an hour now for complex conflict enforcement. I finally booked that remote cabin. It has 0 cell service, 0 community amenities, and definitely 0 shared pool access based on the full moon. Yesterday, I was walking through the park and saw a couple arguing loudly over which brand of baby formula to buy. My initial instinct was to pull out my notebook and start drafting a shared custody schedule for the grocery aisle. But I didn't. I put my AirPods in, listened to a very boring podcast about municipal zoning laws, and walked away. Low contact, high efficiency, it's working. I still have some bad days where I wake up worried about linen wrinkling, but hey, I survived the holy water incident and the ritual time sharing agreement. I guess I learned that the best way to maintain your boundaries is to ensure that anyone who crosses them pays an exorbitant fine and has to deal with a mandatory 50-foot zone. Anyway, that's the update. I'm going to go drink some very expensive, unsanctified whiskey now. We'll update if Randy finally manages to key Alexander's Civic. TBH, I kinda hope he does. For enforcement reasons, of course.